All right. Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Beast back with another poetry review. This time we've got another poem submitted by a patron. This is a poem called As If I Am the Ocean / Almost the Ocean by Akif. Akif, thanks a bunch for the support. Means a lot. So I'm excited to dig into this poem. It's got a good look to it. Just looking at it, I'm intrigued already by the structure, but we'll take a closer look at that as we go on. Before we actually get into it, I'm going to read the thing that I always read. Keep in mind, I am not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing, and the opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mispronunciation or mistake. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. Um, just a couple more things before we get into the video, some notes from the author. As far as content warnings go, the author warned that it could be a bit depressing, so be advised. As far as any notes, they said, "This is my first actual work in poetry. I know it's quite cliche, not very original or descriptive. What I don't like the most about it is I think it needs more imagery and less repetition. I tried to work around it and rewrite it, but I decided to just submit my first work." Awesome. So I laughed a little bit while I was reading that. Just the phrase, "what I don't like the most about it." I don't know. That's for one thing, that's very relatable, but I don't know. Yeah, it's just like you look at something you've created and all you can see are the faults, right? It's like, here are all the things that I dislike about it. I don't know. That's very human. Um, Now, also, I'll point out, um, viewers of mine probably know that I'm sort of like anti-repetition in a way. It's not that necessarily. I just think it's hard to use repetition really effectively, and I think it's kind of a crutch that a lot of poets lean on too hard, including me. Like, when I first started writing poetry, I used a lot of repetition until ultimately I decided, like, the repetition that I use just isn't doing a lot for the poem, actually, so I'm gonna move away from that. And I see that in a lot of other poetry where I feel like the repetition just isn't doing that much. Um, so anyway, I just noticed that you, Akif, you say that it needs less repetition. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you use repetition effectively. We'll find out, right? As far as more imagery goes, that's I don't know, it just depends on the poem and on the reader, right? Sometimes repetition's really great, and sometimes it's not actually what a poem needs, so we'll take a look. Um, in any case, I'm glad you wrote this, I think you should be glad for that too. So, um, one thing I also wanted to note, just a point of confusion on my end. Is this the actual title of the poem, or are you, the author, kind of indecisive between these two different titles? As If I Am the Ocean / Almost the Ocean. If that's the whole title, it's pretty interesting. I don't think I've ever seen a title quite like that. Whereas if you're deciding between the two titles, I guess we'll find out which one might fit better. So yeah. All right, without further ado, here's the poem. Sometimes I feel as if I'm the ocean. My head is filled with terrible storms, almost as terrible as the oceans. My soul is dark and deep, almost as deep, but as dark as the deep. My sanity constantly comes and goes, almost as often as the waves. And when I am lost in myself and drowning in tears, it's as if I am lost in the vast waters, with neither the strength to swim nor the land to swim to. And as I let the cold and dark engulf me, I can't tell if the pain in my chest is from the collapsed lungs or the broken heart, and if the salt burn in my throat is from the ocean or the tears. Okay, all right. So, as a first foray into poetry, I think this is great. I think you've done a really good job. I think my first poem was not as good as this. I'll definitely say that. So yeah, let's take it piece by piece. Um, I would say, first of all, that I think maybe Almost the Ocean is a more interesting title, especially because with this first option of a title, as if I am the ocean. You get that phrase in the first line of the poem. Sometimes I feel as if I'm the ocean. And so, I don't know. You could call it redundant, and frankly, I don't know. I do that a lot because I'm terrible at titling my poems. I'll just make the first line the title and just call it a day. But if you want the title to be doing more than that, then maybe Almost the Ocean is the better title, right? Because it leaves the audience maybe something to consider more fully or think about, you know? So anyway, I'll just say that as we start off. Let's take it line by line, stanza by stanza. Sometimes I feel as if I'm the ocean. My head is filled with terrible storms, almost as terrible as the oceans. My soul is dark and deep, almost as deep, but as dark as the deep. My sanity constantly comes and goes, almost as often as the waves. So I think I see what you were saying about repetition. Whereas this doesn't even feel necessarily like repetition as a device, but simply a case where you might want to just consider the phrasing and maybe open a thesaurus, right? Where if you just kind of reworked some of these lines, then you wouldn't have to be using the same words over again. So, for example, um, my head is filled with terrible storms. Almost, in fact, let's take these first three lines altogether. Sometimes I feel as if I'm the ocean. My head is filled with terrible storms, almost as terrible as the oceans. So we have terrible and terrible, one line apart from each other, and then ocean and oceans, two lines apart from each other. So on the second terrible, just use a synonym, right? You could say horrible, and then on oceans, you could say seas, right? Um, and I mean, ultimately, that's your call. Maybe you want to be using the same words over and over again. But for me, poetry is at its most effective when it's saying something in a new and creative way, right? I think I've said that plenty of times on both channels. Um, and if we're comparing something, if we're doing a simile like we are, right, or a metaphor, sorry, I feel as if I'm the ocean. I think you want to make both sides of that metaphor as interesting as possible. And so just to say, like, my head is filled with terrible storms, the ocean is also filled with terrible storms. Do you get what I'm saying? I think we could come up with something a little more creative there. And honestly, the thesaurus is your best friend. Like like some people want to come up with all the words themselves, and I totally respect that. But for me, I love the thesaurus. I always use it as a tool. So yeah, if you're stuck for words, if you want to get rid of some of these words that seem repetitious, look for some synonyms or consider how you might restructure the line so that you don't have to use those words at all. Right? I hope that makes sense. Now these next two lines are kind of interesting to me. My soul is dark and deep, almost as deep, but as dark as the deep. So, I don't know, I think that line, almost as deep, but as dark as the deep, it just went in a direction that I wasn't expecting, and so I like that it surprised me a little bit. That being said, it is a little bit confusing too. My soul is dark and deep, almost as deep, but as dark as the deep. Yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's like I just kinda have to I had to run that back in my head a couple times before I understood it, which is fine for lots of poems. A lot of poems can be very confusing on their face, and the reward, of course, is, the understanding that comes, once you kinda keep digging into it. Anyway, all of that said, um yeah, I don't know. Maybe play with the rhythm there, and then the repetition won't seem quite so bad, because it'll be clear that you're repeating those words as a means to unlock a unique rhythm. And I think you're kinda close, like I said, the line reads as kind of unique already, at least in my opinion. Hmm. And then, "My sanity comes and goes almost as often as the waves." Um These lines reminded me of something, and I can't remember if this is an idea I had or an idea that I have read elsewhere, but this idea that, like, no wave is the same, right? Because water is constantly, like, changing shape, and the molecules are always moving. So, like, each wave that crashes on the shore, it's never gonna be the same wave, right? Like I said, I don't know where that idea came from, but it's an idea that you might consider building on here, right? Um, if the idea is, that sanity comes and goes like the waves, right? Just build on that idea, you know? I get it, waves, they do come and go, but what other properties do they have, right? You mentioned that you felt that this was kind of unoriginal, kind of cliche. Those were the 2 words you used, cliche, unoriginal. Yeah. Um, and I see where you're coming from, right? Um, now I don't know this for certain, but, um, is it possible that the author maybe English is not their first language? Either that or simply, this is just kind of their introduction to poetry, right? Maybe they just haven't read a lot of poetry, and by their own admission, this is the very first, poem that they wrote. So, anyway, with all of those things in mind, I don't know, that's just the vibe I'm getting here. Yeah. Because it is rather simple, it does sound like, things I've read before. And I think I've said things to this effect on both channels too, but if you're going to use something like an ocean, right, which is a symbol that poets have used since forever, right? The ocean has been around since always. So if that's a symbol that you're going to opt to use, you are really going to have to dig into it to make it your own, right? It's so hard to use a symbol like that in a unique way because it's been done so many times before. So when it comes to storms in an ocean, what is it that makes the storms in this poem unique from every other storm in every other poem? Or the dark and deep, right? The depths of the ocean, rock bottom from SpongeBob, right? Sorry, just a little joke. What are you going to do to make your dark and deep unique from all other depths, right? And then, of course, the waves too. These are all pieces of the ocean that I'm glad that you're diving into as the author, but I think you need to go even deeper. I really think you need to explore these features even further to really emphasize what's interesting and what's unique about them. Yeah. Um, at the very least, though, I think the metaphor is sound, right? You know, my head is filled with storms, my soul is dark and deep, my sanity comes and goes like waves. Um, yeah, these sound like metaphors I've heard before, but at the very least, they're consistent, right? Anyway, second stanza. And when I am lost in myself and drowning in tears, it's as if I am lost in the vast waters, with neither the strength to swim nor the land to swim to. So drowning in tears, that phrase on its own is kind of an overused phrase. But it also strikes me because toward the end of the poem, we get the use of the word tears again. And at the end, I feel it's far more effective than it is here. Um, and then we have the words swim used back to back on lines right next to each other. Um, and again, I think I'm kind of repeating the last piece of advice I gave on the first stanza, but you know, swimming in vast waters, that's a common metaphor, right? And so what is it that makes it unique here? What is it that's different about it here? Yeah. So consider that. I'm sorry. I don't have too much more to say about that stanza. It does just kind of sound like things I've read before, right? And so time to pick it apart further, time to go deeper with it. And then as for the last stanza, and as I let the cold and dark engulf me, I can't tell if the pain in my chest is from the collapsed lungs or the broken heart, and if the salt burn in my throat is from the ocean or the tears. So the very last 2 lines of the poem are where I felt the poem got the most interesting. but we'll talk about that in just a second. Um, and as I let the cold and dark engulf me. So dark again, that's a word that we've seen multiple times already throughout the poem, right? And then broken heart is another kind of cliche, right? Um, I think this this will probably sound weird and maybe even a little messed up, but like, what if you went further with this language, right? What if you really like talked about what it's actually like to drown? I that sounds morbid, I'm sure, but I don't know, like, how else do you make it interesting, right? I mean, there are other ways, I'm sure, but that's just what's most immediately coming to mind, right? Really, like, viscerally get into that idea of drowning, and then you might be able to make even more interesting and more apt metaphors when you understand what the process of drowning is like, right? I hope that makes sense. And then as for the last two lines, if the salt burn in my throat is from the ocean or the tears. For one thing, salt burn in my throat, I think that's visceral. I can like feel that and frankly almost taste that as I read that line. I've swam in the ocean multiple times and there's fewer things more unpleasant than getting a mouthful of ocean water, right? Just that salt water, terrible. I hate it so much. And so I feel a reaction when I read that line, the salt burn in my throat, right? Even worse, like getting ocean water in your mouth is one thing, but then swallowing it, disgusting, right? So that's something that I don't see a ton when I read literature or poems about the ocean, right? Like I see language about storms and deep and waves, uh, land to swim to, right? Whereas the taste of salt in one's throat, that's more unique, I think. And then whether the taste is from the ocean or the tears, like I said, I think that's a pretty effective use of tears, more effective than up here in the second stanza. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's just working. I think that's kind of a I don't know, a clever subversion maybe, or just a clever equivalence, I guess, where, you know, tears are salty and you can compare that to the ocean in a way that makes sense. So I hope this feedback has been helpful. I will emphasize further the part of the poem that was most interesting to me was the part that I could really feel, right? And you mentioned that maybe one of the things that could make this poem better is more imagery. And I think that's a great idea, frankly, because, imagery is not just visuals, but it's all five senses, right? So the salt burn in my throat, that's taste, right? And it's working really well for me. So yeah, rather than taking, I don't know, maybe this abstract approach to this metaphor, um, maybe you make it more personal. Maybe you have a speaker who is actually in the ocean and you get to describe what they smell and what they taste and what they feel around their body and with their hands and what they hear and yeah, what they see too. Even though sight is kind of the sense that we rely on the most in literature, I think it would be more interesting if you focused on the other four senses more than sight. But but the beauty is that you have the option, right? Yeah, I think that would kind of take the poem to a more interesting place than simply this metaphor that you're working with right now. Like, actually put the speaker of the poem in the ocean, which you kind of started to do in the second stanza, but do that and then really expand on it further, right? And Akif, I could ask you, have you ever been in the ocean yourself, right? And if so, what was that like for you? Um, and if we're comparing it to sort of mental health struggles, then what's that like for you now, right? So I hope this is all making sense. I hope this has been sound advice. Like I said, I do think this is better than the poems I wrote when I started writing poetry, which were just, I don't know, super generic, simple stuff that, a teenager would write. Um, But yeah, keep going with this idea. Um, there's a lot that you can keep building on with this, and that's a great place to be, right? Is a place where you can just continue building. So yeah, Akif, I want to thank you once again for your support, and I want to thank you a bunch for submitting this poem. It was great. It was a great read, fun to analyze, fun to pick apart. Remember again that everything I've said here was my opinion. Um, I do hope I do hope at least one thing I said was helpful for you. And ultimately, like I always say, I really do hope you just keep writing. The only way to get better at poetry is to read a lot of poetry and write a lot of poetry. So please keep doing that. Even if this one, won't, I don't know, get published in its current state, that doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It's totally valuable because you wrote it, right? And you said, yeah, you called this your first work. And that's momentous, right? That's amazing. One day you can look back on this and say, this was my very first poem. And you can be proud because it got you to where you will eventually be one day, should you choose to continue writing. So, yeah, really fantastic that you decided to write this. And again, I just hope that you keep writing. So, we're going to call it off there, but thank you again for submitting. And to all you viewers, thank you for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep in mind that this is a rough draft.